Before the season started, we're still waiting on what's going to happen with it. The Capitals were my favorite to win the Stanley Cup again, and it's for a simple reason. They fell out in the first round in 2019, and I figured they would be bound and determined not to let it happen again. And I still believe that should we actually have playoffs this year, that we will see the Washington Capitals able to potentially overcome and become champs. But again, there are a few teams that are in a similar place. You have Tampa Bay trying to, make up for what happened last season. St. Louis is going to want to prove that it wasn't a fluke last year, and Pittsburgh wanting to make one last run potentially. So for the Capitals, as we look into what may very well be the offseason, what may very well end up happening here, we may very well not have more games. They end up with a 41-20-8 record, 90 points, not too bad. Last year they had a 48-26-8 record, 104 points. They were out in the first round, of course. The year before, 49-27-6, 105 points. So a 1-point difference, and they win the Stanley Cup. Proving once again that the regular season is fine and dandy and it's important, but it does not foretell who's going to win the championship. So for them, they were on pace for another season of around 48 wins and around 104, 105 points potentially. I know they weren't playing great going into this stoppage, but I think they still would end up with at least 100 points. Now, it's a pretty solid and together bunch here. Most of them are signed for an extended period, which is why when I got into the contract part, I thought, sheesh, I don't want to make people upset, but we'll get into it. They're only UFAs. They have Kovalchuk. They have Gudas. Now, if Gudas wants to stay and if he doesn't want like a huge raise, Washington can make it work. Brendan Dillon, I think he's been popular since getting there. I think if they could figure out a way to keep him around, they would. And, of course, Braden Holtby. Braden Holtby, the big question mark right now, did they just go with Samsonov as the starter next year and is Holtby done? My guess is probably, yes, Holtby's probably going to end up finding his way out of Washington at the end of this year. And Holtby, as recently as last year, looked like the only guy who might someday, maybe potentially threaten the wins record of Marty Brodeur just because of the sheer wins totals he's been putting up with Washington. But right now, looks like he's fallen off of that trajectory, and we'll see what happens with him over the summer. Do they re-sign him? Do they keep him? Does he go somewhere else? Does he go to a good team where he could rack up wins, or does he end up somewhere else? So, restricted free agents, they're in pretty good shape there. They've got Travis Boyd, who's got arbitration rights. Leipzig also has arbitration rights. I'm surprised Leipzig isn't actually a UFA. It feels like he's been in the league for quite a while. And Siegenthaler is a restricted free agent as well. So there's nobody really out there other than Holtby who may very well get a big raise from the Capitals. Things are pretty well kept together. And their last 3 seasons shows that they've been a contender, champion, and they're always in the running. Now, when I get into best contract, I gave that to Jacob Vrana, and I went over their contracts a lot. I know people yesterday said, hey, Brian Little's contract with the Jets isn't any good. You know what? Little was hurt a lot this year, and in the 7 games he played, he was fantastic. So I think Little gets overly criticized in Winnipeg. And in this case, I think Vrana, his contract, which expires next year at $3.35 million, is probably the best one. Now, Ovechkin's up at the end of next year as well. And depending on what happens coming out of all of this stuff that we're seeing right now, again, I can't say it, but with all this stuff that's going on right now, when we come out of this, it will be interesting to see how much Ovechkin would command, not this summer, but next summer, and how much Vrana's going to make, because it feels like Vrana's taking that next step, and that $3.35 million right now looks like a huge bargain. Now, for worst contract, this again is where I had some internal struggle. So I went with Panik. I chickened out. $2.75 million until 2023, and healthy scratch at points, and he's not that there's any panic in him, right? I always used him for the panic index videos. Richard Panik hasn't had the impact with Washington as expected, but I was also looking at the fact that you've got Oshie, Kuznetsov, and Backstrom all becoming UFA the same year. They make a combined, I want to say, $22 million in cap space at that point. Oshie's going to be in his late 30s. Backstrom's going to be in his late 30s. Those contracts are ones that right now we can look at and say, yep, that's fine. But in upcoming seasons, those may end up being a yoke around the neck of the Washington Capitals when it comes to their cap space. So I had thought about putting those contracts up in the combined number. I didn't. I went with Panik's worst contract. But when you look at the overall picture, those three contracts together could at some point be ones that are... And now people are going to say, well, Kuznetsov's young. Right. So Kuznetsov's going to want more money coming out of that. And we'll see where that ends up. I do think that while Washington has dodged the bullet when it comes to salary cap problems, and 2017-2018 was the best example of that. Coming out of 2016-2017, they had to let some players go because they couldn't afford to keep them and stay under the cap. So 2017-2018 was kind of a ragtag bunch they threw together, and then they win the Stanley Cup. And I'm talking about like their fourth line, their fifth, sixth defenseman. It felt like everything was kind of cobbled together, and then it worked out really, really well during the playoffs. So again, while we can all debate over who was going to win the Stanley Cup this year, and we may never find out, we don't really know. We don't really have any idea. Now, for next season, they have $71.1 million spent under the cap. Now, that number is likely going to end up being, I think, prorated based on what's happened now, the amount of money the NHL's lost, and the looming possibility of not having playoffs. And so if they don't make any alterations, so in the event that the NHL says, well, we're just going to roll with it and maybe do a compliance buyout, something like that, they could find themselves in a little bit of trouble under the cap, because the cap won't be $84 million. I think we can all kind of agree right now. The odds of it actually being $84 million, which was the projection in January, that's not happening. Now, rookie watch, and this is where for the Capitals, this can be key when you've got a team that is contending every year. Having those guys on entry-level contracts, if they can play, you're in good shape. Connor McMichael has generated a lot of conversation this year. I don't know that he's ready next year, but if he could make that jump, into the Capitals lineup and allow them to move one of the players that makes, $3 million, something around there, you might find yourself in a better position with them going forward when it comes to the cap. Connor McMichael, I think, will get a very good look in training camp. I don't know that he necessarily makes it right away, but he's looked pretty darn good in the year after his draft. So he may end up being the steal of that draft. We'll see. Lucas Johansson, there's an asterisk next to him because he only played 45 games last year. He's only played 9 this year. Lucas Johansson, at the time he was drafted, I thought, steal for the Capitals. And then injuries have derailed things for Johansson. We'll see whether or not things get better for him in the near future. I still hope to see him as an NHL defenseman. I'm sure the Capitals do as well. And they could very well need that, especially if Radko Gudas wants money and Dylan wants serious money, and if they say we can't afford to do that. Because again, $71.1 million, that can get eaten up quickly, especially if they decide, all right, we have to keep Holtby. We don't know that Samsonov is ready to be the undisputed starter. We'll keep Holtby. That could eat up a ton of that cap space that's left over. Martin Fehérváry. So Fehérváry came up and played some games this year. Got kind of a cup of coffee at the NHL level, as they call it. And he may very well end up being in their lineup a lot more next year. Again, it depends on what's going to happen with Gudas and with Dylan. Alexander Alexiev. Does he make his debut? And hey, when you've got your last name is Alexiev and you give the kid the name Alex, he kind of becomes Alex. So don't be surprised if at some point he's NHL level if I just refer to him as Alex. So there's some help on the blue line potentially there, again, especially dependent on the health situation of Lucas Johansson. And when a player gets hurt and misses that many games, you have to think it's going to hurt their development. They're not going to have played enough games to necessarily be ready for the NHL. It's going to take them a little bit longer. But we'll see. Gabe Vilardi in LA showed, hey, you know what? Guys can sometimes just do it. Vitek Vanacek. So Vitek Vanacek could very well find himself as the backup to Samsonov if Holtby leaves. He may very well be the guy. I don't know how much faith the Capitals would have in him as the backup. I don't know how anxious they'd be to go with 2 young goaltenders in net. I would think that if Holtby moves on, they probably bring in a veteran backup. and look to somebody who's going to cost them maybe around $2 million and try to make it work that way. It's going to be an interesting offseason for the Washington Capitals, but the good news is most of that core stays together. Most of these players are signed for a very long time. Again, those contracts may very well be seen as not great contracts years down the road, but for right now and going into next season, there's no problems. Not really. The Capitals should be a contending team for as long as Ovechkin can continue to put the puck in the net. If Ovechkin ever actually shows his age, that's where the Capitals end up in trouble. Maybe, because they've still got Kuznetsov and Vrana and Wilson, and there's a good core there. So there you go. Let me know your thoughts in the comments section below as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing right through. You just happened upon this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, for all your support. I'll talk to you again soon.